Some families don't need to shout to cause damage. All it takes is one cold decision selling an 11-year-old girl's treasured instrument and using the $87,000 to build a swimming pool for other children in the same family. When money matters more than a child's sense of worth, the issue is no longer about finances, it's about priorities inside that home. People often say, what's right is right, even when it's hard. But when adults choose what's easy for themselves instead of what's right for a child who is willing to step up and redraw the line. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next twist in this journey. Now, let's listen to her from the heart. My name is Sable Kittredge, and I live with my 11-year-old daughter Lark in a narrow 2-bedroom condo in Pacific Grove, California. The walls are thin enough that when Lark practices, the notes don't just fill our living room, they seep into the hallway, into the neighbor's kitchen, into the quiet spaces other people think belong to them. I've gotten used to polite knocks on the door. I've learned to apologize with a smile. She's preparing for something important. I say, I've said it so many times it almost feels like a script. 3 months ago, my grandmother Vera Hollis officially gave Lark her antique cello. Not just loaned it, not will see, gave it. There was paperwork. There were photographs. There was a seriousness to the moment that made my throat tighten. Vera had spent years teaching Lark in the music room of her house in Carmel Valley, correcting her posture with 2 fingers tapping rhythms against the wood, nodding once when something finally sounded right. That cello wasn't just a gift, it was recognition. It was inheritance. It was the one thing in our family Lark never had to compete for. No one could say it belonged more to someone else. No one could claim she was being dramatic or too sensitive or too much. With that instrument in her hands, she was exactly enough. I didn't grow up feeling that way. I grew up in the Wynn house learning 2 rules: don't make things harder than they need to be, and don't start anything. My younger sister Calliope Cal was louder, brighter, needier. I learned to step aside. I learned that being easy was the closest thing to being loved. I carried that habit into adulthood like a reflex. The week everything changed, Lark had an important rehearsal for the Regional Youth Orchestra audition. Her teacher wanted her practicing on the antique cello, not the school instrument she'd outgrown. Since we couldn't safely keep the antique at our condo humidity temperature, the noise complaints, we'd left it in Vera's music room at my parents' house in Carmel Valley. It was the only place properly set up for it. So that Saturday morning, I drove Lark down the coastal road. She tapped rhythms on her knee, humming softly under her breath. Her binder sat on her lap, rosin tin in the side pocket of her backpack. "Do you think Grandma Vera will be there?" she asked. "She moved into the place in Pebble Beach last week," I said. "She's settling in." Lark nodded, but she didn't stop looking hopeful. Like maybe Vera had changed her mind overnight and come back because she missed the house. When I unlocked my parents' front door with the spare key, the smell hit me first. Fresh paint, sawdust, that sharp chemical bite of renovation. You can smell remodeling the same way you can smell a lie. It's too clean, too new, too sudden. The hallway runner was rolled up. Blue painter's tape stretched across the baseboards. Plastic sheeting covered part of the floor like the house was mid-surgery. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the whine of a power tool. Lark drifted toward the back windows before I could say anything. "Mom," she breathed. I followed her gaze. The backyard had been carved open. A rectangular trench cut into the earth where the lawn used to be. Rebar grids, stacked pavers, wooden forms lining the edges. It wasn't subtle. It was a full in-ground pool in progress. "Is that for us?" she asked. There was so much uncomplicated hope in her voice that I almost hated the entire structure already. "I don't know," I said carefully. "Let's get your cello." We walked down the hallway to Vera's music room. The door creaked the same way it always had. The humidifier hummed steadily. The shelves of sheet music were still lined up. The cabinet stood closed, and the corner where the cello case always rested was empty. Not moved. Not relocated. Empty. Lark stopped mid-step. She didn't scream. She didn't even inhale sharply. She just stood there staring at the bare patch of carpet like something invisible might materialize if she waited long enough. She walked closer, slowly, like approaching a shy animal. "Did Grandma change her mind?" she asked, barely above a whisper. The question sliced through me. "No," I said, but my voice didn't sound certain. She looked around the room, scanning shelves, peeking behind the chair, as if maybe someone had tucked it somewhere safe without telling her. Then she swallowed. Maybe she didn't mean for it to be mine yet. There it was, the self-blame. Immediate. Automatic. I saw it for what it was, a child trained not to assume she was chosen. "Stay here," I said gently. "I'll find out." I walked into the kitchen. My mother, Tallulah Tally, stood at the counter with a coffee mug in one hand and her phone in the other. My father, Dean, sat at the table scrolling through something on his tablet. Cal perched on a stool green juice in a glass that probably cost more than our grocery bill for the week. "Where's Lark's cello?" I asked. My mother blinked like I'd interrupted a peaceful morning. "Good morning to you too, Sable. I didn't sit down." "Where is it?" My father sighed like this was an inconvenience. Handled how he finally looked up. We sold it. The room didn't explode. It didn't shake. It just narrowed. "You what it was worth money," he said evenly. "It was sitting there. Your grandmother wasn't using it. It wasn't hers," I said. "It was Lark's." "It's a family asset," he replied, and it made sense. How much, I heard myself ask. $87,000, he said. $87,000. The number echoed in my head like a dropped plate that hadn't shattered yet. 87,000. Cal rolled her eyes. "She's 11 Sable. She can use a student cello. Jet and Maisie deserve space. They can't exactly cannonball into sheet music." My mother gestured vaguely toward the backyard. "We're doing something nice for the kids." "For the kids," I repeated. "Don't make this dramatic," she snapped softly. "Lucy. Her name is Lark. Lark will be fine," my father said. "Plenty of talented kids use rentals." "And Grandma?" I asked. My mother's expression sharpened. "You are not telling her. She just moved. She doesn't need stress. She needs stability." I stared at her. "Do you hear me?" she pressed. I didn't answer, because in that moment something settled in me with a clarity I hadn't felt before. The renovation started days after Vera moved out. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a misunderstanding. They had waited until the last pair of eyes that mattered had left the house. And as I walked back down the hall toward the music room where my daughter stood in the empty corner, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was going to tell my grandmother everything. That night, our condo felt smaller than usual. Lark sat in the living room with the battered student cello her teacher kept for emergencies. The instrument looked tired, the varnish dull, the sound thin and dry. When she drew the bow across the strings, the note came out flat around the edges. It didn't bloom, it didn't resonate. She adjusted her posture. Tried again. "I can still practice," she said carefully. "It's just harder." "I know." She nodded like she'd expected that answer. After a few minutes, she stopped playing and stared at her hands. "Do you think Grandma Vera really wanted me to have it?" she asked. Or maybe she was just being nice. I felt something inside me go very still. "She wanted you to have it," I said firmly. Lark didn't argue. She just nodded again, absorbing the reassurance the way she absorbed everything quietly without demanding proof. When she went to bed, she hugged me a little longer than usual. I stayed at the kitchen table after she fell asleep. The house hummed with refrigerator noise and distant traffic. I replayed my childhood in the Wynn house. Cal's tantrums, forgiven my compliance, rewarded with silence. Every time I had stepped back to keep the peace, every time I had told myself it wasn't worth a fight. If I swallowed, this Lark would learn the same lesson I had, that her value could be negotiated, that her gifts could be repurposed for someone louder. I grabbed my keys. The drive to Pebble Beach was dark and quiet. The senior living community Vera had moved into was bright, orderly, almost too clean. Lemon cleaner, polished floors, a receptionist who smiled like everything in the world was on schedule. Vera sat in a lounge chair with a book open on her lap when I found her. She looked up once. "That's your something's wrong face." I sat across from her. "They sold it," I said. She didn't flinch. "Tell me." I told her everything. The pool excavation, the $87,000, the phrase family asset, the warning not to tell her, and Lark, she asked. She thought it was her fault, I said. Vera closed her book slowly. Her eyes didn't fill with tears. They sharpened. "When did you last see the file?" she asked. "What file?" "The documentation for the cello, the appraisal, the serial identifiers. You showed it to me months ago." She nodded once. "Good." She leaned forward. "Do you have screenshots of Calliope's posts about the pool?" "Yes." "And the group messages?" "Yes." "Send them to me." I stared at her. "Grandma, are you okay?" She held my gaze. "The cello was never theirs to sell," she said. I felt the words before I understood them. "What do you mean, I will explain when it matters?" she said calmly. Then she picked up her phone and dialed. "Miles," she said when someone answered. "It's Vera Hollis. We need to discuss a trust violation." Trust. The word landed heavy. I had never paid attention to how Vera structured her assets. I assumed the house was my parents' because they live there. I assumed the cello was a gift because she said it was. I realized there were layers I had never looked at. When she hung up, she squeezed my hand. "Go home," she said. "Be with your child. Let me handle this." 6 weeks passed. The pool took shape in filtered sunlight across social media, blue water, stone decking, Calliope's captions about worth every penny, my parents smiling beside concrete and chlorine like they had built something noble. No one mentioned the cello. Lark practiced daily. She grew quieter, not weaker, quieter, focused in a way that felt too adult for 11. Then the group message appeared. "Pool reveal BBQ, Saturday 2 p.m. Bring a side if you're coming." No apology, no explanation, just logistics. I stared at the screen. "Are we going?" Lark asked. Before I could answer, my phone rang. It was Vera. "We're going," she said. I swallowed. "Grandma, what are you doing?" "I'm doing what should have been done sooner," she replied. "I don't want Lark watching you swallow this." I closed my eyes. "Is the cello?" "It's in motion," she said. "Trust me." I didn't know what she was planning, but I knew one thing. That barbecue was not going to end the way my parents expected. By the time we pulled into my parents' driveway the following Saturday, the Carmel Valley sun was high and merciless, flattening everything into bright, hard edges. Cars lined the street. Laughter carried over the low stone wall. The smell of grilled meat drifted through the air like a promise of normalcy. The backyard looked like a magazine spread. The pool was finished deep blue water shimmering in the heat stone deck, laid clean and symmetrical lounge chairs, arranged in careful angles under a new pergola, strung with cafe lights that would glow later when the sun dipped. Someone had set out pitchers of lemonade and trays of food on a long folding table dressed in white. It was polished, intentional, impressive. Calliope moved through the crowd like a host on opening night sunglasses perched on her head, drink in hand, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. My mother stood near the grill with that posture she had perfected over decades, shoulders back, chin, lifted the matriarch overseeing her domain. My father hovered nearby, smiling the satisfied smile of a man who believed he had upgraded his legacy. Jet was already in the pool, splashing with the reckless joy of a kid who assumes every surface exists for him. Maisie floated on a pink inflatable flamingo, squealing whenever someone pretended to tip her over. Lark stood beside me, her towel folded carefully in her arms. She didn't run forward. She didn't ask to swim. Her eyes drifted across the water, slowly taking it in. I watched her try to understand the math without saying it out loud. $87,000 had turned into this. Hey, Calliope called spotting us. You made it. She leaned down to kiss the air near my cheek, then turned to Lark. You look cute, kiddo. Lark nodded politely. My mother approached next. I'm glad you came, she said brightly, like we were guests who had been uncertain about a casual invitation, not participants in a betrayal. My father clapped his hands once. All right, everyone, food's almost ready. A small cluster of relatives gathered near the grill. Neighbors from 2 houses down waved at me. Someone handed my mother a glass of wine. Then she cleared her throat. We've been wanting to do this for years, she announced, projecting her voice just enough. A space where the kids can really enjoy themselves. It's important to invest in what matters. The kids. Calliope raised her drink. To family, several voices echoed. I felt the words scrape against something raw inside me. Family sold my daughter's future. Lark's fingers tightened around her towel. Someone near the back asked casually, Where's Vera? Isn't she coming? My mother's smile faltered for half a second. She's busy, she said quickly. Right then, the side gate clicked open. The sound was small, almost polite, but it cut through the chatter. I turned. Vera walked in slowly, not leaning on anyone, not frail, not uncertain. She wore a crisp linen blouse and tailored slacks, her silver hair pulled back neatly. Beside her stood Miles Kwan, holding a slim leather folder at his side. The shift in the air was immediate. My father's smile drained from his face. My mother's shoulders stiffened. Calliope lowered her drink. Vera paused just inside the yard and let her eyes travel across the pool, the deck, the chairs, the guests. She took it all in without a flicker of visible emotion. Well, she said pleasantly, you've been busy. No one laughed. My mother recovered first. Mom, this is a party, I know, Vera replied. That's why I came. She stepped forward and the crowd instinctively parted. She stopped a few feet from my parents. I heard you sold the cello, she said evenly. The words landed heavier than any accusation shouted in anger. My mother lifted her chin. We didn't want to upset you. Vera held up a hand. You didn't want consequences. My father cleared his throat. This isn't the time for this. Let's talk inside. Vera didn't look at him. You've had plenty of private time. A murmur rippled through the guests. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Someone else pretended to focus on their plate. Vera's gaze swept briefly to Lark, and in that second, I saw something soften. Then she looked back at my parents. The cello was... she began. She let the words hang. The backyard fell completely silent. Even Jet stopped splashing, sensing something he didn't understand. The cello was held in trust for Lark. Vera finished. My mother blinked. What I am the trustee, Vera said calmly. Lark is the beneficiary. That instrument was not a family asset. It was never yours to sell. My father stared at her as if she had started speaking a foreign language. Miles stepped forward, opening the folder. The cello was formally appraised, documented, and insured under the trust he said. Serial numbers and identifying marks were registered. We have already contacted the buyer and initiated recovery proceedings. I felt the words click into place inside me. Trust, documentation, structure. Vera had not simply given Lark a gift, she had protected it. You can't be serious, my mother whispered. Vera's expression did not change. I am very serious. Miles removed a set of papers from the folder and handed them to my parents. What is this? My father demanded. Notice to vacate, Miles said. 60 days. My mother recoiled. This is my house. Vera tilted her head slightly. It is the house you have been living in. The distinction was a blade. I felt the ground shift beneath everything I had assumed my entire life. My parents had lived here for years. I had always believed ownership followed occupancy. It did not. You wouldn't, my father said, his voice thinner now. Vera looked at him steadily. Try me. No one clapped. No one spoke. The sun still shone. The water still shimmered. but the celebration had dissolved into something brittle and exposed. Beside me, Lark tugged lightly at my sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, her voice small but steady. "Am I going to get it back?" I opened my mouth to answer, but Vera stepped closer and looked directly at her. "Yes," she said. Lark let out a breath I didn't realize she had been holding. Around us, conversations faltered and ended. Guests began gathering their things, offering awkward goodbyes. Children were called out of the pool mid-splash, chairs scraped against stone. The party unraveled quietly like a stage set being dismantled in reverse. As we stood there watching it fall apart, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was never just about a pool. It was about who had been allowed to decide what my daughter was worth. The unraveling didn't happen with shouting. It happened with lowered voices and people suddenly remembering other places they needed to be. By the time most of the guests had left, the backyard felt hollow. The grill still smoked faintly. Half-full cups sweated on tables. The pool water reflected a sky that now seemed indifferent. My mother stood near the counter outside the notice to vacate, trembling slightly in her hand. She tried to keep her expression composed, but the effort showed. Calliope moved from anger to panic in under 5 minutes. "There has to be some kind of misunderstanding," she muttered. "Mom wouldn't actually. This is extreme." My father's jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jump. I stayed where I was, Lark beside me. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I didn't fill the silence. For once, the silence was not mine to carry. Miles stepped closer to me while my parents were distracted. "The cello has already been retrieved," he said quietly. "The buyer was informed of the trust documentation this morning. He agreed to return it pending financial settlement." I blinked. "It's back. Yes, it's secure." A slow realization moved through me. Vera hadn't come to negotiate. She had come to announce what had already been set in motion. This had never been about persuading them to admit wrongdoing. It had been about formal notice. Inside the house, my father grabbed my arm lightly and pulled me toward the kitchen. "You did this," he said under his breath. "You went running to her." I told her the truth, I replied. "You could have handled this privately." "You had private time," I said, echoing Vera. My mother appeared in the doorway, eyes glassy. "Sable, you could still fix this. You can talk to her. Calm her down." For the first time in my life, I didn't soften to make her comfortable. "She's not the one who needs calming," I said, "and Lark is not second-tier family." The words felt unfamiliar in my mouth, but they didn't shake. Behind us, I heard Calliope's voice drifting from the living room. "I never said sell it," she was telling her husband. "That was Mom and Dad's call. I thought they'd talk to Vera." I closed my eyes briefly. In the kitchen, she had been the loudest voice insisting that her children deserved space. Now the distance had begun, the rewriting. By the time we left, the sun was lower and the backyard was nearly empty. My parents stood near the pool they had built, looking smaller than I had ever seen them. On the drive back to Pacific Grove, Lark stared out the window for a long time. "Are you mad?" she asked finally. "Yes," I said. "At me?" The question hurt more than anything else that day. "No," I said. "Not at you." I realized then that I had been angry for years at being sidelined, at watching patterns repeat, at telling myself it wasn't worth the conflict. I had lived like someone asking permission to take up space. I wasn't going to do that anymore. The next afternoon, the delivery truck pulled up outside our condo. The hard case was carried inside carefully and set down in our living room. Vera arrived shortly after, her movement steady. We didn't rush. She knelt beside Lark and unlatched the case slowly, like opening something sacred. When the lid lifted, the wood gleamed softly in the light. Lark reached out and touched it with her fingertips first, then laid her palm flat against the body of the cello. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She just exhaled. The silence in the room was different from the silence in the music room days earlier. That one had been hollow. This one was full. Vera glanced at me. "This part is done," she said quietly. "But understand something. Selling an asset held in trust carries consequences." I met her eyes. For them, I asked. For everyone who believed there would be none. As Lark lifted the cello and drew the bow across the strings, the note that filled our small condo was rich and resonant. It pressed against the thin walls and spilled into the hallway again. This time, I didn't worry about the knock on the door. I was beginning to understand that what had cracked open in Carmel Valley wasn't just a party, it was a power structure. And it wasn't going back to the way it had been. The first call came 3 days after the party. I was folding laundry on the couch while Lark practiced in her room when my phone lit up with Vera's name. I stepped out onto the small balcony to take it. Rowan Bexley has formally demanded repayment, she said, without preamble, in full. I leaned against the railing and watched a gull cut across the pale afternoon sky. How soon? Immediately she replied, he's not interested in installments. He purchased an asset under false representation. He wants his money back. I thought of my father sitting at the head of the Wynn kitchen table, for most of my childhood explaining interest rates and mortgages, like he was immune to them. He always spoke about money as if it were something he bent to his will, but the $87,000 was no longer sitting in an account. It was in concrete, in plumbing, in a tiled rectangle of blue water that had already started to evaporate under the Carmel sun. The pool isn't even paid off yet, I said quietly. No, Vera answered. It isn't. Later that week, I learned something else. Not from my parents directly, of course. News in families like mine travels sideways. An aunt mentioned in passing that Dean had taken out a secondary line of credit to finish construction faster. The contractor had wanted payment up front. Dean believed the sale of the cello would cover everything cleanly. The timeline had been tight. He had decided to move quickly. It meant the liability wasn't just the original amount. There was interest, fees, penalties if Rowan escalated. For the first time in my life, I saw a crack in my father's financial confidence. He had gambled on silence, and silence had expired. The argument started spilling out in fragments. A cousin told me she'd overheard my parents fighting late into the night, my mother accusing my father of rushing it. My father insisting that the pressure to have the pool ready before summer had come from Calliope. My sister reportedly saying she never told anyone to sell the cello, that she assumed it had been discussed properly. The version of events shifted depending on who was listening. No one wanted ownership of the decision anymore. They had not been united by principle. They had been united by convenience. Now that consequence had arrived. Unity evaporated. The 60 days printed on the notice began to move with a strange speed. Time when it is abstract feels generous. Time when it has a deadline feels predatory. My mother started calling more often. At first, her voice was soft. Sable, this doesn't have to go this far. You know your father didn't mean harm. Then she shifted to indignation. You've humiliated us in front of everyone. Then tears. We're your parents. My father texted instead. Brief, controlled messages. This is getting out of hand. You need to rein this in. The community is talking. I read them. I did not answer right away. For years, I had been the mediator, the one who smoothed, who translated, who softened words before they hardened into resentment. I had run between rooms like a volunteer firefighter putting out emotional sparks. I stopped. The fire they were facing was not mine to extinguish. One afternoon, I drove by the house and saw a real estate flyer box near the curb. Not a listing, just brochures for available rentals, a sign of preparation. Later that week, I heard that Calliope and her husband had begun looking at properties in another neighborhood, not to help my parents, to separate from them. We have to think about Jet and Maisie, she reportedly said. Of course she did. The logic hadn't changed. It had simply redirected itself. Meanwhile, something was shifting quietly in my own home. A distant relative made an offhand comment at a small gathering, laughing that Lark had stirred up quite the storm. Lark looked up calmly and said, I didn't stir anything. It was my cello. The room fell silent. I watched my mother freeze for half a second at the sound of her granddaughter correcting an adult without apology. Later that night, I asked Lark how she felt about saying that. She shrugged. It's true. It was such a simple sentence. It felt revolutionary. Vera called me again as the weeks passed. I will not extend the 60 days, she said, no matter what they say. There was no anger in her voice, only clarity. They're asking if you would consider more time, I told her. I won't, she replied. Boundaries only work if they hold. I didn't argue. I understood. As the deadline approached, the house in Carmel Valley began to look less like a showcase and more like a storage facility. Boxes stacked near the garage, curtains taken down. Patio furniture shifted awkwardly to the side. The pool still shimmered in the backyard. It looked expensive. It looked impressive. It also looked heavy. The final week before they were required to vacate, I drove by again. Through the open garage door, I saw my father taping up a box labeled kitchen. My mother stood near the counter, staring at nothing. The water behind them glowed in late afternoon light, perfect and unused. Something that had been built as proof of status now felt like an anchor tied around their feet. And for the first time, I understood that the cost of that water had never really been about money. It had been about who they believed could be sacrificed to fill it. The house sounded different without tools and music and chatter. When I walked through it for the last time before they moved out, my footsteps echoed faintly off bare walls. The framed photos had been taken down. The rugs were rolled. The kitchen counters were clear, except for a few stray pieces of tape and a forgotten mug. The silence felt honest. My mother stood in the hallway outside the old music room. You could have handled this more gently, she said, her voice low. It didn't have to become this. I looked at the empty space where Lark's cello case had once rested. Gentle. Gentle had been my entire childhood. Gentle had meant stepping aside. Gentle had meant swallowing resentment. Gentle had meant telling myself it wasn't worth the fight. I didn't say all of that out loud. I handled it the only way that protected my child, I replied. Later that evening, Vera invited me to sit with her at her small dining table in Pebble Beach. She pulled out a thick binder. This is the trust, she said. She walked me through it slowly. The language, the clauses, the dates. She'd established the structure years ago. Not recently, not in response to the pool, years. I saw patterns, she said plainly. I knew I needed to protect certain things from becoming negotiable. You thought this could happen? I asked. I knew something like it could, she answered. The realization was sobering. She had anticipated that her daughter might treat assets as leverage. She had designed safeguards long before anyone realized they would be tested. My father asked to meet me one last time before the move-out date. We stood in the kitchen now, half empty. Are you satisfied? He asked. There was no sarcasm in his voice, only exhaustion. No, I said honestly. I'm not satisfied. I'm relieved. He looked at me as if trying to find the version of me he used to negotiate with. You've torn this family apart, he said. No, I replied. I stopped holding it together. He studied my face for a moment. You're enjoying this. I'm protecting my daughter, I said. That's all. He didn't respond. On the final day, a moving truck blocked the driveway. 2 men carried out furniture piece by piece. My mother stood near the front door giving instructions that sounded hollow. Calliope was not there. She'd already moved into a rental across town. The pool behind the house reflected an empty sky. No guests, no music, no applause, just water. Word travels quickly in communities like Carmel Valley. For a few days, I expected whispers about the ungrateful daughter who had turned her parents out. Instead, I heard something else. People were talking about the legal risk of selling property held in trust, about documentation, about liability, about how reckless it had been. The narrative shifted. It wasn't about filial piety. It was about a decision that could have ended much worse. 2 weeks later, Lark and I packed our belongings in Pacific Grove. The condo felt even smaller as we carried boxes down the narrow stairs. But this time, I didn't feel like we were retreating. We were relocating. When we unlocked the front door in Carmel Valley, the house smelled like dust and open windows. The air moved freely through rooms that had once felt crowded with expectation. There were no comments about how loud Lark laughed, no reminders to keep practice short. Vera moved back in a few days later, not as a guest or a responsibility, but as the rightful authority of the space. One evening, she sat across from me at the dining table. "I will eventually transfer beneficiary rights for this house to you," she said. "Under the trust structure, it will remain protected." I understood what she was offering: security, structure, a future that could not be quietly repurposed by someone else's priorities. The story had changed my position in the family permanently. I was no longer the compliant middle ground. I was the line. That night, Lark stood in the living room and lifted her bow. The first note filled the house completely deep, resonant, unrestrained. It traveled down the hallway into the kitchen up the staircase. No one told her to quiet down. I stood in the doorway and listened. The structure that had governed my childhood had not collapsed because of yelling or drama. It had shifted because of a single sentence spoken calmly in a backyard under bright California sun. The cello was held in trust for Lark, and with it so was something else: her right to take up space. Even after my parents moved out, even after the cello was back where it belonged, I felt something unfinished in the air. The house in Carmel Valley had settled into a quieter rhythm. Vera kept the windows open in the mornings. Lark practiced in the afternoons. I unpacked boxes slowly, deliberately, like someone learning how to live in a space that no longer required negotiation. But there was still the matter of the sale. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived from Miles Kwan. I sat at the dining table and opened it carefully. The letter inside was direct. If full repayment was not received within the specified window, the buyer would proceed with formal civil action. I read the sentence twice. This was no longer contained within the boundaries of family conflict. This had crossed into legal territory with consequences that could outlive any argument. Court records are permanent. Civil judgments are searchable. Reputations in a town like Carmel Valley are fragile. I imagined my parents' names attached to filings about breach of trust property. I imagined the conversations at country club lunches, the raised eyebrows, the distance. A few days later, Miles called. "Rowan Bexley has filed," he said. "He's seeking reimbursement plus associated costs." "So it's official," I murmured. "Yes." There would be no quiet resolution hidden behind polite language. If this went to court, the details would be documented: the appraisal, the trust structure, the timeline of the sale. It would not be something that could be dismissed as a misunderstanding. My mother began calling more frequently after that. "Sable," she said one evening, her voice tight. "If this continues, we could lose more than the house." I didn't answer right away. "Can you talk to Vera?" she pressed. "Maybe she can soften her position." There it was again. I was still in her mind the bridge, the intermediary, the one who could persuade someone else to reduce consequences. "I'm not going to interfere," I said calmly. A long pause. "So you're just letting this happen?" "I didn't make it happen," I replied. After we hung up, I sat in the living room and listened to Lark practicing scales steady and focused. I realized my refusal no longer carried guilt the way it once would have. It carried something steadier. A few days later, my father asked to meet me. We sat at a small cafe in Monterey Neutral Ground. He looked older than he had a month earlier. "You know this could get ugly," he said quietly. "It already did," I answered. He rubbed his temples. "Your grandmother mentioned a protective structure around that instrument once. I didn't think it was formal." I looked at him carefully. "You knew I asked." I had heard her say something about ensuring it stayed in the right hands, he admitted. "But she talks like that about everything. So you suspected it wasn't yours to sell." He hesitated just long enough. "I thought she wouldn't escalate." That sentence changed something inside me. This wasn't ignorance. It wasn't confusion. It had been a calculation. He had believed that silence would prevail, that Vera would prioritize peace over documentation. He had been wrong. At school, the situation reached Lark in small, sideways ways. One afternoon, a parent approached me near the parking lot. "Quite a story," she said with a tight smile. "That pool situation." Before I could respond, Lark spoke up. "It wasn't about a pool," she said evenly. "It was about my cello and its back." She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't rush away. The other parent blinked, then nodded awkwardly. I watched my daughter walk toward the car with her shoulders straight. A week later, her teacher emailed. A regional coordinator had reviewed a recent recording and wanted Lark to audition for an advanced placement within the youth orchestra program. Not just participation, advancement. I sat at the kitchen table holding the email, feeling the weight of what might have been. If the cello had not been returned, if we had settled for a rental instrument, if Lark had absorbed the message that her gift was secondary, this opportunity might have slipped quietly past us. The phrase, "It's not a big deal," echoed in my memory. It had been a big deal. My mother asked to see me one last time before the repayment deadline. We met in a nearly empty living room of the house they had already vacated. The echo between us felt wider than the room itself. "You chose a side," she said. "You chose Vera over us." "I chose a boundary," I answered. "You could have preserved the family. A family doesn't survive by sacrificing a child's future for convenience," I said quietly. She looked at me as if I were speaking a new language. Within days, my father informed me that they had agreed to settle outside of court. Full repayment. Additional costs covered. Confidential resolution. There would be no public trial. There would also be no denial of responsibility. They never called it an admission. They didn't have to. The highest point of this story had not been raised voices in a backyard. It had been this moment when silence was no longer protection, when money had to follow action, when reputation could not shield behavior. The cost was not only financial, it was social, personal, structural, and it was real. After the settlement was finalized, the silence from my parents became absolute. No invitations, no group chat messages about holidays, no carefully curated photos of family unity. The win structure I had grown up inside, the hierarchy, the unspoken roles, the expectation of compliance had collapsed quietly. In Carmel Valley, the story circulated, but not in the way I had feared. People weren't whispering about an ungrateful daughter. They were talking about risk, about how dangerous it was to sell property held within a trust, about how easily that situation could have escalated further. The image my parents had curated for years, a flawless, controlled household, had cracked. Vera spent an entire afternoon reviewing updated documents with me. She added clearer clauses regarding high-value assets. She explained beneficiary protections, trustee obligations, contingencies. "This isn't about distrust," she said. "It's about clarity." For the first time, I understood the architecture beneath the surface of ownership. How intention could be codified, how boundaries could be written into law rather than whispered and ignored. She wasn't only protecting Lark, she was teaching me how not to depend on hope. I began to look at myself differently. I had not sold the cello. I had not poured concrete, but I had been complicit in a lifetime of silence. If I had said nothing this time, Lark would have learned that her value was negotiable. That peace required self-erasure. Standing up had not only shifted the outcome, it had shifted me. One evening, Lark stood in the wide living room and began to play. The sound filled the space without obstruction. It traveled up the staircase and across the kitchen tile. No one shushed her. No one suggested she take it outside. After she finished, she looked at me and said, "I was mad at first." "I know," I said, "but I'm not scared anymore." The results of her audition arrived 2 weeks later. Accepted. Advanced placement within the regional youth orchestra. I printed the email and placed it on the kitchen counter where sunlight caught the ink. This was not abstract justice. This was a future continuing uninterrupted. That night I sat with Vera on the back patio. "Do you ever regret how public it became?" I asked her. She shook her head gently. If I had cried that day instead of smiling, they would have negotiated it away, she said. They would have promised to fix it quietly, and nothing would have changed. I remembered her expression in the backyard, the calm delivery of a single sentence. The cello was held in trust for Lark. That moment had shifted everything. The pool still existed. Water still reflected the sky behind a house that no longer belonged to my parents, but it no longer symbolized triumph. Inside this house, the cello rested in my daughter's hands. $87,000 had never been the true measure of loss. The real cost would have been teaching Lark to shrink. I stood in the doorway one evening and listened as she played a piece Vera had once performed decades earlier. The notes were full, unrestrained, unapologetic. Family, I finally understood, is not a place where someone must become smaller to keep others comfortable. And this time, my daughter did not learn that lesson. When everything settled, I realized this story was never only about money or even about a cello. It was about what we choose to protect when it would be easier to stay quiet. In families, love and hurt often sit at the same table. And sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do is not to fight louder, but to stand firmer. Not to win, but to make sure the smallest voice in the room is still heard. We all grow up learning something about worth what it costs, who decides it, and how easily it can be overlooked. But maybe the deeper lesson is this: boundaries are not walls against love. They are the shape that allows love to stay healthy. And when we protect what is fragile and true, we are not tearing something apart. We are giving it a chance to grow honestly. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing and becoming part of this space where we listen without rushing to judge. And if you feel comfortable, leave a few lines in the comments about a moment when you had to stand up quietly for something that mattered. Thank you for spending this time with us. Wherever you're listening from, take care of your heart, and we'll see you in the next story.